Welcome to the Vue HeatMap Chart tutorial. In this video, I will show you how to bind a two-dimensional array in JSON data to the Syncfusion Vue HeatMap Chart component using the cell binding and row binding methods. I will open an existing Vue application where I have placed the heat-map component bound to an array of data using the row binding method. In this method, each object in the array is rendered as a column. To see how to get started with the Vue HeatMap Chart component, refer to the video linked in the card above. I will run this application using the npm run dev command to show the initial output. Look at the heat map chart rendered with the defined data source. As I said before, each object in the array is rendered as a column here. Apart from this row binding method, you can also render the array data using the cell binding method. Now let's see how to bind array data using the cell binding method. In this method, you can define the position of data points by defining the x-axis and y-axis values. I modify the existing data source with two-dimensional array objects. Each object in the array represents the x-axis, y-axis, and the appropriate data point. For example, here 0 represents the position of the data point in x-axis, 1 represents its position in y-axis, and 14.5 is the cell value. I modify the string arrays, x-axis and y-axis based on the data source. As I said earlier, these arrays store the collection of axis labels and display labels on both axes when mapped to the x-axis and y-axis properties, respectively. I need to use the data adapter to configure the heat map chart with two-dimensional array objects. So I import the adapter module from the Syncfusion EJ2 Vue HeatMap package. Next, I need to inject this adapter module in the Provide section. For that, I will import the Provide service from Vue first. Then, inject the adapter module in the Provide section. After that, I define an object named Data Source Settings and set the adapter type property to cell. Since I have bound the two-dimensional array object data source, I set the isJSON data property to false. I then assign this object to the data source settings property of the heat map chart. Look, the heat map chart is rendered using the cell binding method. Next, I will show you how to bind JSON data to the heat map chart using the cell binding method. Let me remove the existing data source and create a new JSON data source with row ID, column ID, and value fields with appropriate values for them. Here, each object represents each cell in the table. Row ID represents the position of x-axis, column ID represents the position of y-axis, and value represents the appropriate cell value. I also set the isJSON data to true. Then I map the row ID to the X data mapping property, column ID to the Y data mapping property, and value to the value mapping property. Check now, the heat map chart is rendered with the defined JSON cell data. Similarly, you can bind JSON data to the heat map chart component using the row binding method. To demonstrate, I remove the existing data source and create a new one by adding the fields, region, and years such as 2000, 2004, and so on. Then I modify the adapter type to table and map the field region to the x-axis by setting it to this data mapping property. The other fields will automatically be mapped to the y-axis and data point values respectively. So I will remove those properties. Then I will modify the x-axis and y-axis labels based on the data source. Look here, the heat map chart component is rendered with the JSON data using the row binding method. In this video, you have seen how to bind an array and JSON data to the heat-mapchart component using the cell binding and row binding methods. If you want to see a working example, you can download it from the GitHub link in the description below. I have also provided a link where you can see if you qualify for a free license key to use our Vue products through our community license. If you found this video useful, like the video and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.